All right, everybody, we have a special guest, always a special guest on the Allison Morrow channel, but an extra special, you can't fool her kind of guest, right, Dr. Elder? Because she is a specialist in critical thinking, and she's going to critically think through all your questions and answer not only how we can become better critical thinkers, but we'll also talk about the news as well, since that's the focus of my channel. But Dr. Elder, why don't you first tell us your background? You are the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking and executive director of the Center for Critical Thinking. But what exactly does that mean? What do these centers do? What is a critical thinker anyway? And definitely, what is the president of a Foundation for Critical Thinking? And thanks again for coming on the channel.
Well, thank you for inviting me. There are a lot of questions in that question, so let's see if I can answer most of those. The first question I'll focus on is what do we do at the Foundation for Critical Thinking and the Center for Critical Thinking? The Center for Critical Thinking was established in 1980 at Sonoma State University, which is in Northern California, by the late Dr. Richard Paul, who was a philosopher. And his goal in the beginning was to teach students. But what he found is that by the time students got to the college level, they really lacked fundamental critical thinking skills and abilities and traits. And so he realized he was going to have to go beyond the classroom, and he began to reach out through the establishment of the Center for Critical Thinking to the educational community at that point, mainly. And by that, I mean K-12 teachers, higher education teachers, faculty at colleges and universities. His objective was to advance fair-minded critical societies through the cultivation of education. So that's our beginning place. The foundation comes on board about 10 years later to really support the center financially. So these are sister institutions advancing the same purpose. Beyond that, we also focus on advancing critical thinking in society more generally. And by that, I mean in businesses, in government, in the military. Our approach is the only approach authorized for use in the U.S. military if you're teaching critical thinking at the college level. And that has been true for over a decade. So our approach is widely used not only in the United States, but also abroad. Our outreach is international. We're concerned with advancing fair-minded critical societies across the world in every classroom, in every home, in every relationship. You could say at every moment, and I'll elaborate that a bit later. So what is critical thinking then? Critical thinking is a complex concept that can be made simple to some degree. And so let me try to give you a simple entrance into the concept. Our late founder would often use this phrase: critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to improve your thinking. So now that's catchy, and that gets us into the concept, but it doesn't really tell us how to do it. So how do I think about my thinking while I'm thinking? And so through the years, really, you could say over the last 50 years or more, we have been developing the concept of critical thinking in order to create explicit tools that anyone can use to advance their thinking, beginning in preschool. And so we teach people how to take their thinking apart. For example, whenever you think, whenever you reason, there are 8 elements, and you mainly reason as a human being. That's what you mainly do as you go through the day. You are using certain elements. You have a purpose, you're asking questions, you're using information, you're coming to conclusions or making inferences. Your inference making is based on your assumptions and your assumption base, which is connected to your concepts, the ideas that you're carrying around in your mind, and they're guiding your thinking. And these are all connected to your point of view. And you can see how we could easily get locked into point of view. And all of the elements of reasoning lead to implications or consequences. So we don't just think, we don't just reason, we act on the reasoning. When we act on our reasoning, there are implications and consequences. So for example, Allison, you asked me to come onto your show. You had a purpose. You were asking questions. You were using information, and you made inferences. And based on those inferences, you contacted me. So that's an example of reasoning. Now, most people have no idea that they're using these elements. So our belief is that if all of us knew that whenever we're reasoning, we have a purpose, we are asking questions, we use information, we can tap into that. That's just one conceptual set in our approach to critical thinking, but that's a beginning place.
Okay. So there's a lot there. Let me ask you this. What does it look like when someone is not critically thinking? I mean, could we talk about it from the inverse perspective? And then I'm just curious too, in addition to that, we don't have to just talk about the news, but I'm just curious, when you're watching your average TV show, TV news, or reading, I don't know, some of the more popular print outlets online, are you sitting there thinking, wow, all these journalists are doing really well at critical thinking? I don't know if that's a loaded question, but I'm just curious, what does it not look like? And do the journalists that we're dealing with in today's world, do you see the skills you're talking about being used widely, or do you feel like maybe we need a refresher course?
Well, critical thinking has never been widely used in human societies. It's always been used by a narrow group of people. And before the last 50 years or so, we didn't even really have the concept of critical thinking. That grew up in the last half century. So we have always been, humans have always fallen prey and always will fall prey to their own egocentric thinking and their own sociocentric thinking. And to just give those a short definition, egocentric thinking is thinking which is locked into its own narrow viewpoint, and or it's just looking to gain what it wants to gain. In other words, it's selfish. So it's selfishness, or it's closed-mindedness, rigidity of thinking. And all of us fall prey to this. Every single person on the planet sometimes thinks that they know more than they know. Every single person on the planet is sometimes selfish. So we have to fight that tendency, that set of tendencies in ourselves. Second tremendous barrier to critical thinking is the problem of sociocentrism. And to put this in a short definition again, this just means groupthink. It means going along with the group. It means having to be validated by other people in order to feel like you yourself are okay. So it's having to be part of the club. It's having to be part of the group. In fact, I was just reading in Maslow's early work in the 1950s on self-actualization, and he's talking about these very points. And he's talking about how people who are self-actualized are able to stand alone in their beliefs. They don't need to be validated by other people. So we've got these tremendous barriers in the background logic of our minds, whether we are journalists, or whether we are parents, or whether we are engineers, whatever we are doing, these are lurking in the back of our minds. The Dr. Jekyll and the Mr. Hyde conception is somewhat helpful. All right, so you asked me then about journalists. So first of all, the way that you asked the question, it was interesting because
it's not critically thought out.
It's not easy to ask the question now, I think, because the way that news media has changed so much in the last 10 years, in the sense that we've gone from people actually getting a newspaper at their house, or several, to now really everyone on the planet could potentially be a person giving out news. So this is the first move that we have to make when we are trying to understand how to read the news. So it was difficult 10 years ago to teach about media bias and propaganda. It's much more difficult today because you have that problem. So in other words, lots of people can't even distinguish between a, let us say, bona fide news source and someone just having their own news channel and giving their own news.
Like me.
and all of this is, all of these sources are better or worse. There are no standards guiding this process that are agreed upon by human beings or by journalists. So I'll circle back to then your question about how would, the question was, well, what does it look like when you're not thinking critically? And so let me address that and come back to the journalism question, because that gets into another primary conceptual set in critical thinking. In fact, you could say it is the main conceptual set, in the sense that if you take the term critical and the term thinking, then you get thinking, which we all do continually throughout the day, at high or low quality or somewhere in between. What the term critical adds to that is criteria for thinking. So what is the criteria for thinking that we should all be adhering to? Well, let me give you some what we call essential intellectual standards that come from a much larger group existing in natural languages that we speak every day. One is clarity. See how simple that is? Clarity. Are you clear about what it is that you've read? If you're not clear, you can't go further and assess it.
Well, but how do you know if you're clear on something if you don't know what you don't know? I mean, I may walk away from your book and say, I'm totally clear. And then you say, well, what did you read? And I repeat it back to you and you're like, yeah, that's not what I wrote. So how do you know? And I think this is an interesting question, specifically also related to journalism, because I used to work with scientists quite a bit, because they would do these interviews and then they would see what was put on air. And they were like, that's not what I was talking about. And of course the question was, well, maybe they were oversimplifying the story to the point where now they got the research wrong, but maybe they just walked out of the laboratory and they flat out did not understand, which is why I started telling scientists, always have them repeat it back to you before they leave. That way, you know what they at least know. But say you live, you're not doing that. How do you even know that first part, that you're clear on what you're even talking about?
Okay, so now you made a very powerful intellectual move, which is to repeat back in your own words what you've heard, and now if the person is there that you're who's thinking you're clarifying, they can say yay or nay. And now if they're not there, but let me just say that is a very important move that you made. So I don't want to give that short shrift. It's often violated. Often people don't just take the time to say, let me just see if I understand what you just said. So that's an easy way to check for clarity. But let us say you're reading a book and you don't have the benefit of the person standing there going, no, that's not right. Then you can do something similar, which is read the sentence and say it in your own words out loud. Mm-hmm. And then go back to the original sentence and see if what was there is what you just said. Because you see, reading works of excellence or listening to people who are distinguished thinkers is seductive. So in other words, I hear this person speaking, it sounds eloquent and it's deep and it's broad and so forth. And so I can think, okay, I've got that. Now, all right, good. That felt good. But then the question really is, how was I transformed by it? Not did I think it was a good presentation.
Is that because we have an innate desire to want to, like, if we believe we're in the presence of an authority, for instance, we want to understand them. We have a drive to. So in other words, we're less likely to say, I don't understand, or even realize that we don't understand, because we want to understand, and just the desire of wanting to understand allows us to kind of gloss over what we don't. So we just sit there and like, yes, that's great. I get it, because we want to have understood.
Well, this is related to sociocentrism. It's actually a product of that, because it's not, so you do want to understand it, but in that case, more importantly, you want to appear to understand it, because you don't want the other person to think I'm an idiot. Okay. There's something wrong with me. And you see, this is a tremendous barrier to education, because the educated mind is continually asking questions, is willing to go out on that limb over and over and over again, has very comfortable out on the limb, it never says that this is a stupid question. They just plow through. And if somebody then treats them as if they've asked a stupid question, well, then they just know that that other person doesn't understand how thinking works.
And on top of that, I feel like in today's world, it's not only that you ask a stupid question, but you could ask all kinds of questions that then lend your audience to believe you're any number of isms or obics or whatever. And I found, when did I do my master's degree? 2004 to 2007. This was before Twitter was really a thing and people could just mob you and call you out and basically ruin your life on social media. And I'm curious, I really don't want to derail you because I want you to go back to what you were talking about. But just as you were thinking, or as I was thinking about what you were saying in that regard, like, I don't want people to think I'm stupid. It feels like there's now 10 more onion layers of that. And not just in your physical classroom or in your cocktail party where you're talking to somebody, but now you can amplify that shame, I guess, layers and layers and layers beyond. And I'm sure that does not necessarily do well by the critical thinker or the one who wants to be a critical thinker, because in order to, I guess, to take risks intellectually and to take risks with critical thinking, it would seem like you'd have to be able to put yourself out there and maybe have your nose bloodied a couple times. But if that's something that ends your career at this point, or your life at a college or whatever else, it seems like there are people who are less interested in taking those risks.
Yes,
and journalists too, not just students, but I feel like that's a plague on journalism right now, is people who will write about safe topics and write about them in a safe way because they're just too nervous to not just look like an idiot, but to look like any number of social ills.
Again, you have a lot of questions in your
Sorry.
Well, they're excellent questions, and there's just, as you see, a lot to focus on here. The news, the mainstream news, is designed to sell things, to make money. It's a company.
Yeah. And
a company is going to have to survive in the world that it's thrust into, that it exists in. And so in every country in the world, you're going to have the journalists are set within the social ills, social ideologies, social taboos, social customs that surround them. And it's, worse in some countries than in other countries, but that's one thing. And it's the same is true for teachers. You see, they're set within the social ideologies of the day, of the world that they live in. So if we want teachers to be educators, then the people have to be educated. Do you see? So they have to come from an educated populace. Right now, they're not coming from that. So so journalists are trying to survive in the world that is laid down for them. And they're going to do what keeps them getting paid. And when you have that premise, you have problems implicit in the process. You're not going to be able to escape it. The downside of capitalism. So that's one thing. So then you have exceptions to that. If you think of, for example, investigative journalists. Mm-hmm. So they'll sometimes go out on a limb. You have publications like The Nation magazine. But even these alternative news sources, are still often set within the social ideologies of the culture. Mm-hmm. So, for example, it's always helpful to give an example. So think about the way we talk about in the mainstream news, the way we talk about, the way we address, the way we present sexuality. It's in a very narrow way. And there's certain things that are acceptable, and we talk within that range of acceptability. And if you have a differing view of sexuality or an alternative view, you're not going to put that out there because it wouldn't be accepted in the culture. So this is just one example. And another example is take the way that the mainstream news treats the enemies of the United States and the friends of the United States. So if you're our enemy, then we're going to focus on your negative points. We're not going to say anything about your positive points if we can avoid it. And if you're our friend, then we're going to avoid your negative points. And you see, that's part of the problem that's always existed in the news media.
And so I was trying to pull up your book. I think I did. So this is because you were referencing sociocentric and egocentric tendencies. And I want to just tell people there are links to your books in the description of the video so that they can check them out for themselves. I'm curious, though, when we're talking about this, say it's egocentrism or sociocentrism, and then on scale, that gets turned into, over time, bias into propaganda somehow. Curious your thoughts on the level of awareness that most people have. And I guess, this isn't not just in the media, but wherever you may work or live, we're repeating stories or repeating talking points. We heard them from church. We heard them from the grocery store. I don't know. We heard them from the news. What do you think is the level of awareness, though, for the people that are repeating that? And I guess, I don't know, maybe we do go back to the news, that they are doing that, I guess. What do you think is the level of awareness that that's what is going on? Because is this something that we're just regularly engaging in, that we're just, because maybe that is critical thinking, I guess, at the end of the day, is that you're aware that you're doing that. But I found in my old industry that very few people at my level were sitting there thinking to themselves, I am repeating propaganda. They were thinking that they were engaged in gatekeeping, truth telling, whatever words they would use to describe it. And not even were unaware, but were very disinterested in being pushed back on that. That it very quickly sort of written off if there was another idea that would challenge that as propaganda or something else. They're very disinterested in even sort of saying, oh, I didn't realize I was, even when you presented to them another opportunity to think through something differently. So I'm just curious, I guess, on your, the level of awareness that those of us who are participating in that telephone game are, really have.
Okay, first of all, most people lack even a fundamental level of self-reflection about anything. So the level of our ability, the level of our ability to think about our thinking and to really examine it and to be open to different viewpoints is a low level in human cultures. And let me just, before I answer that, let me go back to just a little bit more of the theory of critical thinking, which will help us. So we have intellectual standards, we have criteria for thinking. Our thinking needs to be clear. We talked about that briefly. It needs to be accurate. It needs to be relevant. It needs to be broad when we have more than one point of view that we need to consider. It needs to be deep when we have complexities in the issue that we're facing. It needs to be significant rather than superficial. We need to look at this fairly, so we need to apply the standard of fairness, and we need to have sufficient information to answer our question. Now, these are 9 essential or 10 essential intellectual standards. Connected to this are intellectual virtues. When we are developing as critical thinkers, we're not just developing skills such as the ability to gather relevant information. Lots of journalists, all journalists can do that, gather relevant information. But that doesn't mean they have the character that you are alluding to. Character such as intellectual humility, where you can distinguish at any moment between what you know and what you do not know. Not only can you do that, but you want to do that. You have a great desire to do that. You have great passion to be spot on accurate, as a high level scholar would be. You have intellectual empathy, so you can enter viewpoints that are different from your own, especially those that you disagree with. And you can do this in good faith in order to be moved by the argument, not to dismiss it, to show us how it's wrong. So intellectual humility, intellectual empathy, intellectual integrity, applying the same standards to yourself as you apply to everyone else. Intellectual perseverance, being able to work through difficulties, fair-mindedness, confidence in reason, confidence that in the final analysis, humans are best served by following the facts wherever they lead, even if we don't like it. So these are some virtues and some intellectual standards that need to be taught in schools of journalism. Are they taught now? To a very small degree. I could ask you, Allison, were you taught these in your educational process?
More so probably because I was a history major and not a journalism major. So I think actually what saved me in a lot of ways was that I was not a groupie when I got into the industry. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't part of the in group. I never found myself to be part of the in crowd. I was always an outsider. Mm-hmm. And I think history, even if my professors weren't teaching me critical thinking, in my opinion, learning history teaches you at the very least that there are factors that go into how things are the way they are. It didn't just get this way for no reason. There were people in power. There were people that were not in power. There were influences on the outside and on the inside. And if you're paying attention in a history class, the last thing you do is leave and say, oh, I just accept reality for what it is. There was nothing that got us here to where we are. And so you start noticing that, how those influences and factors play out in modern day. So I don't know, maybe that was helpful. And then also I have a Master of Divinity degree where I studied theology, philosophy, and psychology. So I think that was another place where I did a little bit more of that kind of thinking. But like you've brought up that sort of desire to be part of the crowd and to go along with the ideas around you that are acceptable, this sort of innate desire to not be cast out. And I think, I don't know, maybe if you've always, or for a considerable part of your adult life, you've never felt like you were on the in crowd, you don't feel like you're losing as much. I guess maybe for me, there just wasn't as much to lose by questioning things.
Well, right. You were unusual with your background knowledge, and that may be why you didn't stay in the industry. Because if it's harsh when groupthink is controlling the process and you yourself are thinking more critically. It's going to be very hard to stay in that pathological environment, because that's what it is. Whenever people are using the standard, it's true because we believe it, there's a problem. And if you can't question that, if you can't open that up, then and your mind is intellectually curious, you're going to have problems in that kind of environment. And I think this, by the way, is one of the reasons why there is so much mental illness in the human species. One reason is because we're constantly asking people to fit into a world that is sick in many ways. And if you're going beyond them, if you are growing, if you're becoming more and more self-reflective, it's going to be very difficult for you to stay in that environment.
Okay, I have a couple questions that came in a little bit ago. Is she a mind reader? Russell asks. I don't know what that means, but maybe
that means that I'm saying things, that my reading is I may be saying things that Russell is experiencing in his own mind. And
there you go.
You
are an educational psychologist, so you have that side of you, this psychologist part, which I'm guessing is sizing people up on a regular basis. I don't know.
I do naturally analyze people from the point of view of psychology. I always have done. My earliest memories were of analyzing my own family members. And of course, it would have been very unsophisticated. I was about 6 or 7 years old. But for example, when I watch a movie, I'm looking at the interrelationship between the humans mainly. And so I wouldn't be watching action movies because they wouldn't have any of that. I'm interested in the integral workings of the mind.
Okay, and somebody did ask about my glass here. It is a mason jar on a stem, which my friends got me as the redneck wine glass. So if you want to buy it, just let me know. I think it's going to be part of my merch store at some point. Allison and Dr. Elder, how do you do that? I'm not totally sure what we were talking about at this point, but say I listen to a really informative conversation. I gain a lot of thought, connect a lot of dots. By the end, though, what sticks, the rest gone. It's maybe talking about retaining.
Yes. How do you do that? So I think that one powerful way to do this is often the most powerful things that we can do to develop are the most simple. And so here's a simple move you can make. You've listened to an informative conversation. Let's say you think this is an informative conversation. So as soon as this is over, go into a private room and ask yourself, actually, better yet, write down 3 things that you learned that you're going to act upon. Because the key is to become more and more transformed over time. That's the idea. And how do we do that? We take the idea, we have to bring it into our mind. We have to bring it in actively. If it comes into your short-term memory, we know that's not good enough. It's got to go deeper. How do we get it into long-term memory? And I run a study group once a week, and I've worked with many students. My first question is almost always, so what? So what are you learning? So you studied this and you studied that. We talked about this, we talked about that. So you asked me these questions, I answered them. Well, how are you different this week from last week? Because if you're not any different, then how is this working for you? So ask yourself, what did I learn? 3 things, and then go back to them until they are part of who you are. Do you see? When it becomes part of who you are, then you no longer need to even ask yourself how you learned it. It's just part of who you are.
Mike says, fortunately, I figured out I was an idiot a long time ago, so don't have a problem asking questions or asking someone what they meant. Bob, do you have 1 or 2 books you'd recommend to people blue-pilled on propaganda to get them started thinking about the right issues of most impact?
Yes, we have a book entitled Fact Over Fake, and that is the current edition of our media bias and propaganda book. So it's called Fact Over Fake, and it's you can easily get this, should I say, on Amazon, but Fact Over Fake. And this gives you guidelines for seeing through propaganda, not only in the media, but also government propaganda. Because the government leaders are often just using the media as their mouthpiece.
Right. And to go back to what we were talking about before, I've mentioned this conversation on a couple different videos that I've done. Great example, talking to a friend recently about this, and just the suggestion that she's repeating that was, I mean, she just was like, well, we'll have to agree to disagree, but it's like, see, I guess maybe what you were saying, like, you don't want to think that about yourself, right? Nobody wants to think that they're a mouthpiece of some kind of government propaganda. But what if you believe it? I guess this is where I'm kind of
get into that. Yes.
Okay. Because
sorry.
my next question on that vein is, what if you want it to be true? In other words, you align with the government, and you even kind of maybe deep down know that there are people that are adversarial to that or other counterpoints to it, but you don't want them to be right. You want the government to be right because you align with their particular point of view. Is that, what do you call that? Bias, propaganda?
So by the way, that takes us back to Freud. And what we know about the human mind, is that it naturally engages in self-deception. We don't have to learn this, no matter what your conditioning, no matter how well or poorly you were parented, you will be a self-deceiving animal. In fact, that would be a good title of the book, Humans, a Self-Deceiving Animal. So we can deceive ourselves into believing anything whatsoever. And we have done that. Think of history. You're a historian. You know what I mean. We can think of many examples of leaders who were able to whip up hysteria in their countries and were self-deceived in their views, and they were able to get people to jump on this bandwagon and then we have genocide in some cases. So self-deception connected with rationalization. We can rationalize anything that we want. And we often use the standard, not the standard of accuracy, but the standard of it's true because I want to believe it. Or it's true because the people around me believe it. It's true because I've always believed it. These are common standards sitting in the back of our minds, coming from our egocentric and a sociocentric nature.
Okay, I'll be interested to see how you answer this question, because I think critical theory is all the rage now on college campuses and in corporate atmospheres. Confidence in reason is considered by the new leftists as part of white culture. They reject reason, hard work, timeliness, etc. It's critical race theory. Now, if I can break down that question or broaden it just a little bit, I mean, you could go specifically that, but the idea that I guess the guys you're bringing up, Freud, for instance, are considered by a lot of people in the postmodern world to be sort of your Enlightenment white guy power elite, and that now we have to kind of look at these intersectional places of power in a way that makes one person someone whose ideas should perhaps be less, what would be the right word? Perhaps less welcome in a particular conversations versus another person's because of one or another identity characteristics, and that the idea of reason itself, and I will attest to this, like even when I was in grad school, a decade or plus ago, this idea of logic and reason did come across to some people in my classrooms as being a very sort of outdated Enlightenment way of looking at the world. And that now we're postmodern and we need to look at other things, like, again, these identities. So I'm curious, on that vein, like my second, I guess, follow-up question is how does all of this work in a world where it does seem like we're constantly talking about our exterior identities, where we come from, these intersectional points of power structures, and then how do you do critical thinking in that world when oftentimes it's sort of looked down on as something that should have gone away in the 19th century? I know that's a very large question.
I hope we have plenty of time, because let's just try to enter this in a place that would make sense and address the questions that are being asked.
Okay.
To the extent that postmodernism denies classic literature, it's problematic. In other words, if postmodernism is going to come in and say, look, we don't want those standards anymore, we want just any standards that we decide to have, that won't work, because we need standards for thought. And anyone who says, I'm just going to ditch Freud because he's a white guy and that's part of the past and we don't think like that anymore, anyone that says that doesn't understand anything about Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud was mixed. He comes at a time in history where we really knew almost nothing about the unconscious mind. And he opens that door up for us and helps us see how the mind continually deceives itself. Now, if postmodernists like to leave self-deception behind, all I've got to say is good luck, because then you're leaving behind the human species. So it doesn't make sense to throw out distinguished works from the past. And scholars certainly would not be doing that. And so that's one thing. The idea that we need to go beyond, sort of white people and expand to focus on different, let's say, people of different ethnic groups, and we need to focus on their rights and all of that is connected with that. That's not new. That comes from critical theory from many years ago. So critical theorists are focused on making the world a better place, and they're coming to this from different perspectives. Fair-minded critical thinking, which is what we advance, is focused on the same purpose. That is, to make the world a better place for everyone. And that includes sentient creatures, not just human beings. So, therefore, let me bring in this concept, a concept we almost never hear today, and that's the concept of egalitarianism. And egalitarianism says, let's have equal rights across the board and treat people with respect as human beings. And though I loathe the ways in which people of color are treated and different ethnic groups are treated in terms of bias and prejudice, and though that is wrong, we've got to elevate the conversation so that we can bring everyone to the table of humanity. And that means that we all expect certain things from each other and that we're not focused on skin color. And I guess for me, it's a little hard because I grew up in the era where I was bused across town to go to an African-American school so that we could be integrated. And I was part of that experiment in the 1970s. And at that time I thought, well, this is just no big deal. What is the problem with people just having a different skin color? I just don't see it. And now it's how much worse than it was even then. We haven't really made progress, that not the progress we could have made and should have made. But it all comes back to fundamental bias and prejudice in thinking. It's not about being prejudiced against Blacks or Asians or women or anyone else. It's about being prejudiced. It's about being biased. And if people don't want to talk about these concepts because they think it has to do with rationalism, and rationalism is part of enlightenment, and enlightenment is out, that just doesn't make any sense. Because it's like saying we're going to throw out some of the best thinking that has ever been done. So I don't know whether I answered the question.
Well, no, I guess you did. I think there's probably a lot more there to talk about. I think my concern always was how do you know that when you're saying that, well, our way of we are more advanced than that way. It seems to be cyclical because obviously someone's going to say that about you 100 years from now. So we'll just toss you out altogether. So we don't give, I think in some ways we're very easy to just look back at the past and say that because of all these things, we have to throw out all of these characteristics. We have to throw out what you're saying. Well, somebody's going to look at us and say, how do I know that I'm just not saying all these things because of all of my characteristics, in which case you shouldn't listen to me either. Like we're all saying things because of, our time and place in the world. And so you can't just, if you would just end up throwing out everything, I guess, if that was your standard of criteria. Well, at least that's always been my question.
Well, yes and no. By the way, intellectual standards such as clarity, accuracy, relevance, breadth, depth, logicalness, sufficiency, these have always been adhered to by the best thinkers, objectively speaking, in every discipline. Why? Because they're doing the best work in those disciplines. And you can say, what do you mean by the best work? Well, I mean, if you're taking engineering, the best designed bridges, that there is criteria that is used to decide how to build a bridge. What if we just decided, well, those are Enlightenment standards. We don't want those anymore. We want different standards now because that's the old way of doing it. It absolutely makes no sense. So what we've got to have, what we must have are intellectual standards going across history. And we need to use these standards to determine how to judge any ideas within history. So if I'm reading Plato's Republic and Plato is saying that women are inferior to men, then I'm going to press on that. And I'm going to ask myself, well, wait a minute, is that true? And if so, how? How would that be true? Why would he have even thought that back then or ever? Do you see? So I'm going to apply the same standards to his thinking that I'm going to apply to your thinking or anyone else's thinking. But we don't have those standards right now in human societies. We're not giving assent to those standards.
Okay, I wanted to bring up this book of yours, How to Detect Media Bias and Propaganda in National World News. This is all of the interesting quotes at the beginning. I guess you say the uncritical mind is unconsciously driven to identify truth in accordance with the following tacit maxims, like it's true if I believe it, it's true if we believe it, it's true if we want to believe it. So we've talked about a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What I thought was interesting at the beginning here, besides the fact that you say that democracy is only effective essentially, or its level of effectiveness mirrors the well-informed the level of information, I guess, that you feel like people have. If I'm saying this correctly, you can totally stop me and tell me I'm getting it wrong. But this is, I thought, was such a true read. So the logic of constructing news stories is parallel to the logic of writing history. In both cases for events covered, there is both a massive background of facts and a highly restricted amount of space to devote to those facts. The result in both cases is the same. 99.9999% of the facts are never mentioned at all. And if objectivity or fairness in the construction of news stories is thought of as equivalent to presenting all the facts and only the facts, objectivity and fairness is an illusion. So that made me think, so then, because I get a lot of people that will come to my channel and say, oh, okay, I just want objective news. But what I often have said and not really been able to necessarily articulate as well as you have here is, I don't really think that's possible, given the fact that there's constant editorialization throughout the day, even by the most well-meaning and well-intentioned journalists. Obviously, you only have a certain amount of time to pursue what you're trying to learn. Then you only have a certain amount of time to put it together and to understand and digest it yourself. Then you only have a certain amount of time to present it to the audience. And then they only have a certain amount. To me, they're just a telephone game, even for the most well-intentioned, non-sinister Wizard of Oz type journalists. It just seems to be something that is an illusion. So I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about that? And if you're a news consumer, how should you be thinking about an outlet that you want to consume? Like, if we're going to just lay objectivity in the grave and we're going to throw, what should we be looking for in a journalist that we want to elevate to a level of, not necessarily to say trust, because I think that's sort of, I don't like that either. But consume, because we feel like this is having a positive impact on our understanding of the world around us.
Well, first of all, by the way, the updated version of this is the book entitled Fact Over Fake.
Oh, okay.
So that, just so you know, but readers will see the same diagram in that book.
Okay.
All right. So what this does show is that whatever else is true, just an emphasis on these stories, this small set of stories of all the things that are happening in the world, is itself biased. So that's the first move. But I would say this. Now, there is something that people need to be aware of now that's grown up in the last 10 years, and that's the concept of advocacy journalism. Mm-hmm. And now it's the norm to go to the news channels that just focus on your side, because that's what you want to hear, just your side. So that's problematic, obviously, because then what if there are problems in your side? So we need to be aware of whether the news source we're looking at is taking an advocacy position, and we need to know what that is.
Do you consider advocacy journalism also somebody who is advocating for a particular cause that may not necessarily be like Fox News versus MSNBC, but I've deemed that this is the way this issue, like I've predetermined the narrative about a particular issue that I'm covering as good versus evil, and I'm advocating for what I see as good. Is that also what you would consider advocacy journalism?
Yes, and it is when you're advocating for a position and you're not giving us the alternative relevant positions, then how are we to appropriately judge that? You see, because you're actually leaving out what is relevant that we need to know to judge for ourselves. What journalists should do is trust the people with the facts and give us the facts and let us judge for ourselves. But if you're continually as a journalist judging for me, then, well, where's my critical thinking? I don't need to engage it. So that's part of the problem. But now, having said that, I would say, um, if you want to just have a sense of what is happening in the world, so that if you're talking to someone and they're talking about something that's happened, you have a sense of what that is, then you can look to something like the New York Times, because you get a sense of the mainstream, a mainstream news source. But then you have to understand that the New York Times is also biased for the reasons that we've already talked about, because all journalists sit within social ideologies. So we know that, therefore, that we can't just take a mainstream news source and follow that. We need alternative news sources. But those alternative news sources should be adhering to intellectual standards: clarity, accuracy, relevance, depth, breadth, logicalness, fairness, and sufficiency, and their justifiability, and there are others. So we don't just want alternative news. I mean, we can get that any day, and we can get skewed news. We can get highly skewed news. So the first thing is to figure out, how skewed is this news? And second, ask yourself, why do I keep going to this source? Why won't I allow myself to consider other sources? So, in our book, we recommend some alternative news sources, and there are others that are popping up. But we need good alternative journalism. We need more alternative journalism than we have.
So I just stopped at this, the objectivity of intellectual humility. So I guess that kind of goes back to something that you were talking about earlier, which is at least just admitting that you don't know something, or being willing to admit that and then seek that out. Is that what that is discussing?
Yes. And if you embody intellectual humility, which is one of the intellectual virtues I did mention earlier, then you want to build your knowledge base, but you want to make sure that it is knowledge and not prejudice. So, in other words, knowledge is based in truth. Truth is based in facts. Facts can be verifiable. Facts are not whatever you want them to be. They're not just, you can't just say this is a fact and we're supposed to believe that's true. That's Orwellian. If you say that this is a fact, an educated person should be able to verify the truth of that fact. And if you cannot verify that, then as a consumer, you need to ask yourself, well, why am I listening to this person when they're spewing untruths as truths and claiming that the other side is engaging in fake news? Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So
go ahead. Sorry.
I was just so then, to get back to intellectual humility. So when we are embodying this, again, we have a clear distinction between what we know and what we do not know. And we understand that of all the knowledge in the world that exists or has ever existed, we know almost none of that. If you start there, then you realize that if you were to live 5,000 years, you still couldn't learn everything there is to learn, because there's just so much knowledge available to us.
So what do you think about then when you hear journalists say, for instance, this was something when I was watching the extremism in the media hearing, the congressional hearing about this, and it's been a lot of that recently, whether it's tech or mainstream news. And one of the witnesses they had was Soledad O'Brien, who was on CNN for quite a while. And she said something that I've heard a lot of journalists say, and Lester Holt repeated the same talking point. We need to stop booking liars. We need to stop spreading misinformation. We need to stop acting like all sides are equal in value. We need to just basically the premise is we need to do a better job of sifting through the crap and putting out there only what is good for the public and what we have determined to be the truth. The problem that I have found with that approach, because that never says, but, you hear them say that and it's like, everyone's like, yeah, or not everyone, but a lot of journalists would say, of course, yeah, that's our job. That's what we're supposed to do. They never, though, then say, but we don't many times have the capacity to determine that. We don't necessarily always know what we're talking about. We don't have all of the facts. We don't have the the background to make those kinds of decisions. What are your thoughts on that approach, I guess, because I find that to be very prevalent in mainstream news and modern day corporate legacy journalism, is especially even more so when there are people like me who have defected, because there are no standards now where I am. I have no standards. I'm not under the corporate. I don't have the logo in the background that says we stand for truth or whatever else my newsroom was running at the time. And so it feels like there's even more desire in those circles, in the legacy media circles, to differentiate themselves by doing this, by saying, hey, we sift through the misinformation. We need to be doing the research for you and giving you what we determine to be true. Like I said, on the surface, maybe that sounds like a great idea to a lot of people, but I know the amount of, even like I said, the best intentioned journalists, I know the amount of time and research and thought that they're putting in a lot of these stories, and they simply just do not have the background and ability to make those determinations. And so it concerns me when they start talking that way, because they are going to start locking out information, and they already are, but they're doing it with a very, they're just doing it with less than complete foundations for making those decisions.
Yeah. And I would say that is dishonest, and it's highly problematic. If you are in any way skewing the facts, or if you don't know if you're skewing the facts, then that you shouldn't be saying what you're saying. And there is nothing, we can't excuse it by saying, well, we'd only have a short amount of time. And that's the same thing that teachers say. Sorry, we just have a short amount of time. We don't really have time to educate anyone here. Well, that's not going to work if you call yourself an educator. So if you're a journalist, you ought to be a person of integrity. And a person of integrity is a person who does not say something that he or she does not know to be true. And so it's true that we should stop spreading disinformation. But I want to distinguish between truth and facts, because facts connect with truth. But I think it's better to use the term fact, because a fact can be verifiable. And we should just be putting out those facts, but included in that are the facts from the other side. So it's easy to sensationalize something by showing a small group of people protesting something. But what about all the people that aren't protesting it and that agree with it? You see? So if you have a TV camera and you can hone in on this group and it makes it look like a huge group of people protesting, then you're skewing the facts. So I'm just saying that nothing excuses misinformation from either side.
How do we create a forum where one can test their view on reality and grow when so many institutions have been corrupted by this drivel? I don't want to give them my money. Thank you for being bastions of critical thinking, says Jacob. Thanks for the super chat. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's an interesting question. We actually have a community that people can join. It's called criticalthinkingcommunity.org. And there you can talk to one another, and everyone there is focused on critical thinking. So that's one thing. But I think that people have to learn the tools of critical thinking. There isn't any quick way to do this. And everyone has got to give assent to these standards. Everyone all humans in the end will need to value intellectual virtues and intellectual standards if we're going to change the conversation.
Okay, I think this is interesting too. Many of the fact checking is actively blocking information, protecting the narrative. The trusted fact checkers make money by checking facts. And I do think that's kind of it does become an issue. Like some of the social media platforms do have, right, they have these fact checkers that go through and they'll rip off what they have determined to be misinformation. But some people have, investigated and looked into where these people are funded, and they usually do come from some kind of partisan background. And so then always the question is, like, who fact checks the fact checkers, and how do you even have critical thinking in a world where information is disappearing? You can't, it's very hard to find it because of the control that maybe just a few companies have over what we see. But I don't know. I think it's probably more of a statement than a question, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, again, this would not be a problem if people were understanding the tools of critical thinking, because they would see that that's not really a form of fact checking if there's some kind of incentive or bias. So you can't trust people from the get-go in that situation. Some things seem really obvious, but we don't take them seriously, such as that point.
Dr. Elder, is there anything that I have not asked you before we wrap up that I know there's a million things you would probably be able to talk about. Again, she's written, at least 5 or 6 at minimum books?
Well, we have, I think, 4 books I've written with our late founder, Dr. Richard Paul, and then I have a book on sociocentric thinking. And then we have about 26 thinker's guides to critical thinking. So let me just say this. Remember that critical thinking has never been valued in the mainstream in human societies. So if you, meaning you, anyone listening, if you feel that you think at a higher level, maybe you don't know why, but you can see things that other people don't see, and you're doing some critical thinking, just understand that you're in the normal distribution. You're not in the center. You're on the wing. And therefore, it's going to feel uncomfortable sometimes, and you're going to be frustrated. And the best thing is to focus on your own development, focus on how you can influence other people in a positive way, how you can bring the world to a higher place, how you can contribute better to the common good, how you can deal with your own egocentric and sociocentric thinking, how you can focus on when and how you are biased and prejudiced, where you violate intellectual standards. Focus on yourself and be comfortable in being alone and creating products and projects that are an expression of your uniqueness. Sit in that uniqueness, learn the tools of critical thinking. Don't look for other people to validate you. Don't look for anyone else to be rational. Don't expect that. You'll see it, but don't expect it. And it's one person at a time that we can realize critical societies, but we're a long way away.
I really do appreciate it. And I'm glad that you said the part about taking some time and quiet. When I'm asked what could fix the news business today, which is a huge question, I really don't have the accolades to answer, but I try to give something. And I think maybe sometimes people think I'm a little bit too woo-woo about this, but that's what I always say. I say that I think that you got to start with yourself, and you have to start spending a little bit more time detached from the noise around you so that you can get to know yourself a little bit better, and then take that into the journalism world and have a better understanding of the world around you based on the fact that you're starting to get some more self-awareness. And that, I think a lot of that, it's easy in the news world, especially, to just be distracted constantly by other people's problems. It's funny because you're a psychologist. And I thought I wanted to be a psychologist until one of my psychology professors found out that I had a family member who was struggling with addiction, and I wanted to be an addiction counselor. And he asked me if I had ever gone to therapy for that. And I said to him that I wanted to help other people with addictions because I can't help this person. And he was like, okay, have you ever thought about, the fact that you might be wanting to transfer your desire to save this person onto other people and maybe want to go to therapy? And I was kind of offended at first, but I ended up going for a couple of years, and it really helped me. And by the end of it, I don't want to I don't want to be an addiction counselor anymore. I'm going back to news. But I think it is one of those industries where you can focus on a lot of the distractions in the world around you. You can focus on a lot of people's problems if you don't have the interest, or maybe there's fear around your own, your own inner world. And so that's something that I say quite a bit.
Well, can I just say
please
this
do.
to add to what you've just said?
Mm-hmm.
I think you see the way that I see the human mind is we don't just stand still. We're either developing or we're regressing. And we tend to be regressing because we tend to waste our time with people who are at a low level of thinking. And so, for example, I do no social media. I never go into social media.
Wow.
Because I don't have any time for that. And I'm not saying you should never do that, but I would say don't try to get news from social media. And if you are getting any, you'd better make sure of the source. And again, and then ask yourself how much of your time is eaten up by other people. How often do you think, I'm just wasting my time right now? Well, last time you went to a party before COVID, were you really enjoying it? Was it really a good use of your time? Or were you sitting there thinking, I'm not really getting anything from this? Mm-hmm. And for me, the answer is to read in the classics. So I can go home and I can read in the works of Socrates. I can read in the work of Bertrand Russell. I can read in the works of Peter Singer, a more current philosopher. I can sit and talk to Socrates rather than sitting and talking to someone who's just wasting my time and boring me and making me think I'm crazy. So that the level of thinking in human societies tends to be so low that it's bringing you down if you're engaging in that too much. So choose wisely, use your time to create your own self, to become the flower that you could become. What is that flower? Where is your uniqueness? Every human being is unique. Where is yours? So that is some of my advice. You could see I could have more, but I'll stop.
Yes, no, it's great. Well, I have to have you, if you will, I would love to have you come back on and talk about more stuff. I know we've only scratched the surface of it, but again, Dr. Elder, thank you for coming on today. Everybody, links in the description for books and all that good stuff. And the other platforms that I'm on. Again, Dr. Elder doesn't know this, but as many of you all know, I've called this Anti-Authoritarianism April. I've demonetized my channel so we can have free thought and free expression on other platforms that are not always censored. And so in case Dr. Elder was too controversial for YouTube, you can see her interview on the other sites that are linked in the description as well. And I hope you all have a great night. And thanks again, Dr. Elder. I'll see you next time.
Thank you. I'd love to be back.